Often Muslims love to argue against the Trinity, charging it as a polytheistic doctrine that affirms the existence of three gods. Although their arguments all seem to fail, let's grant for argument's sake that these succeed. Well then, this becomes a huge problem for Islam. To understand this, we first need to understand Muhammad's religious movement. Modern scholarship and data has shown that the community Muhammad established was not initially one that was exclusive of any non-Muslims. Much rather, it seems to have been inclusive of any adherent of the Abrahamic faith, with Jews, Christians, and Muslims all joined together into a single group, who were united by their monotheism and belief in the Day of Judgment. Muslims were merely a subset of the believers. The main proponent of this thesis, sometimes called the Pan-Abrahamic thesis, Fred Donner, argues that this idea is echoed throughout the Quran. For example, the word believer is used far more loosely than the word Muslim. He explains, "It is of course true that the words Islam and Muslim are found in the Quran, and it is also true that these words are sometimes applied in the text to Muhammad and his followers, but those instances are dwarfed in number by cases in which Muhammad and his followers are referred to as mu'minum, believers, which occurs almost 1,000 times, compared with fewer than 75 instances of Muslim, and so on. This suggests that the early community was more broad and transcends an exclusivist idea of strict Islamic identity." Donner further shows that the words believer and Muslim, despite being related, are not synonymous. For example, he cites Surah 49, verse 14, which reads, "The Bedouins say, 'We believe.' Say to them, 'You do not believe, but rather say, 'We submit.' For belief has not yet entered your hearts." Belief clearly means something different than submission in this passage. Perhaps the strongest Quranic evidence can be found in places such as Surah 2, verse 62, which includes the explicit identification of Christians and Jews as believers. It reads, "Indeed, the believers, Jews, Christians, and Sabians, whoever truly believes in Allah on the last day and does good will have their reward with their Lord, and there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve." Commenting on passages like these, Stephen Shoemaker explains, Quran 2 verse 62 and 569, for instance, associate those Jews, Christians, and Sabians who believe in God on the last day with the community of the believers. Like the believers, they will have nothing to fear or regret. Faith in God and the last day here again are the defining qualities of the community, and this belief both secures salvation and transcends the communal distinctions between Jew, Sabian, Christian, etc. Shoemaker also notes that similar ideas are echoed in Hadith, which indicate the only requirements for membership in the community was the declaration of monotheism and paying one's dues. The evidence for this hypothesis piles up further, including the Constitution of Medina recognizing Jews as part of Muhammad's community, or historical accounts of Christians in the Islamic military. It is on the basis of this data that there is a growing scholarly consensus in Donner's Pan-Abrahamic hypothesis.
Here is a non-exhaustive list of scholars who agree with some version of what can be called the Pan-Abrahamic thesis and or fuzzy borders. So what's interesting is that even Patricia Crona herself would fall in this list, as would others who have written against Donner's thesis, such as Robert Hoyland.
Researchers even describe it as the most accepted theory of Islamic origins. So what is the significance of this? Well, as we saw earlier, this community of believers was united by their profession of monotheism. So if Christians were allowed in the group, then they must have been regarded as monotheists by Muhammad. But of course, the majority of Christians around Muhammad would have been in some way or another Trinitarian. Shoemaker notes that there is no evidence of any Unitarian groups, meaning that Muhammad would be allowing polytheists into a community that was exclusively monotheistic. This would entail that the Quran is wrong in Surah 53, verse 2 to 5, which reads, "Your companion has not strayed, nor has he erred. It is not but a revelation revealed, taught to him by the one intent in strength," which refers to Gabriel. This passage is explaining how Muhammad is infallible in his theological teachings. So if he is teaching that Trinitarians are monotheists, he would be fallible, making Islam false. Moreover, as we saw earlier, the Quran includes Christians as believers, meaning that Allah made a mistake in calling people who commit shirk monotheists and believers. So again, Islam would be false. Now, our Muslim friends are likely to object by pointing out verses in the Quran which critique the doctrine of the Trinity as polytheistic, such as Surah 5, verse 73. However, it is unlikely that this is referring to any orthodox doctrine of the Trinity once we look at its wording. It uses the word thalatha, which translates to three, when we know there was an Arabic word for the Trinity, al-faluf? Why would the Quran use a different term, free, to reference the doctrine if its intention was indeed to refer to the Trinity? For this reason, John Block argues that this can be answered if we understand the Quran as critiquing a heretical Christian sect that would have been present, known as Philoponeian monophysite tritheism, developed by the Greek philosopher John Philoponus, which posited the existence of the divine persons as three separate divine entities that each possess their own individual divine nature. He writes, therefore, the translation Trinity in place of three or third of three at Surah 4:171 and Surah 573 is the result of the evolving tafsir of the translators and not indicative of the meaning of the text and the historical context in which it was revealed. The context of composition was the refutation of Philoponeian monophysite Christian doctrine, a tritheist sect of Christianity devoutly followed by Abu Halifa, the Bishop of Narjan. Interestingly, Block further points out that the deliberate choice of terminology in the Quran is strikingly similar to that of Peter of Kalinikium in his refutation of tritheism. He shows that Peter's critique shown on screen is echoed in the Quran. Thus, the Quran does not critique the normative doctrine of the Trinity. Similar can be said about Surah 19 verse 35, which denies that it is befitting for God to take a son, contradicting the Trinitarian commitment to God having Jesus as his son. However, the usage of the Arabic word walad implies a literal biological son, which is contrary to the Arab Christians who would describe Jesus as ibn. As Korchide and von Stotch explain, this rejection is probably not aimed at Christians because no Christian would ever describe Jesus as the walad of God. Arab Christians are instead to regard him as the ibn of God, as people must have known at this time that the Quran was written. Surah 1988 are therefore, as Al-Razi mentions in his Quran commentary, not leveled at Christians but at pagan Arabs who believed that God had a walad. So this yet again poses no challenge to the doctrine of the Trinity. So, to recap, the historical data we have suggests that Muhammad included Trinitarians as a part of his monotheistic community of believers. In addition, the Quran described Christians as believers. This means that if the Trinity is polytheism, then Islam is false, as the Quran and Muhammad would be wrong. However, this does not disprove Islam. To get out of this, Muslims just need to admit one thing. The doctrine of the Trinity is a form of monotheism.